Welcome back to the Lead in Detection podcast. Today, we are joined by Julia. So many of you will know Julia from the fraud scene, speaking at many events in Money 2020. So looking forward to dive into a lot of that insights and information that she holds. Yeah, welcome and thank you for joining.
Thanks so much for having me. I'm really excited to be here.
Yeah, awesome. And today we're going to focus on merchant frauds. Yeah, fraud is a big spectrum, has many different areas. And today we're going to talk about merchant fraud in particular. So, why have we chosen that topic today? Why is it hot?
Yeah, I think we talk a lot about consumer fraud, and I think it makes sense generally why we do that. I think just in terms of the scale and the fraud we're seeing, my previous job was at Cash App, where we were dealing with 56 million of consumers. Of course, I think there are a lot of conversations, and at the conference that I go to, it's a hot topic, but I don't think we should underestimate the scale of merchant fraud. And while it can happen in smaller numbers, in terms of the smaller number of merchants, I think the losses and the fraud we're seeing could be really damaging to the companies.
So the headlines we see a lot of the focus is maybe on the identity layer with consumers and people, romance scams. These kind of issues are the headlines, right? So that's the volume, but merchants is still out there. So you've seen it, the evolution of merchant fraud. How did you see it when you first got into the industry, and how's that changed to where we're at now?
Absolutely. Yeah, I've been in risk and compliance space for about 15 years now, and with the past 9 years of them being in fintech. And so kind of going back 9 years ago when I started looking into merchant fraud and credit risk and other issues, I think it was just so much harder to actually design and execute the fraud. Now with AI technologies, as an example, you could use AI to spin up legit looking merchant storefronts in minutes. So it has become a commodity. It's become really cheaper and accessible for fraudsters to do that. And I have, real examples in my history where we lost millions of dollars because we were seeing websites for merchants that looked completely legit. The documentation to verify the business existence and also KYC also was either stolen or created as a synthetic document with AI, where even our manual analysts were reviewing those merchants and they were passing them because they looked completely legit. Only until those merchants started transacting and they were using a different processing URL, we were able to connect the dots and see that, URL that they provided at the onboarding, which could have been Nordstrom.com, a very legit, very established retailer in the US. And then they were using completely different processing URLs. So 9 years ago, I think this is something that would have required quite an effort on the fraudster side. Now, given it's commoditized, the scale is just definitely growing much more significantly and exponentially.
So back then it was big risk, a lot of effort for fraudsters, but big rewards. And now those rewards are very similar. Big businesses, but the cost of entry is so low. So kind of what's being done? I mean, it sounds that the issue is growing. So how are we pushing back on this and adapting?
That's a great question. And I can give you a really high level view of what I think.
Yeah.
Starting with, why we're still dealing with fraud. And if you look at the ecosystem and the different players that are impacted by fraud across consumers and merchants and processors, networks, banks, etc., why are we on a really big level from the ecosystem are still not solving it? And this is a separate conversation, but I think on a more tactical and practical level, I think we are doing things right. And I said that at Money 2020, I'll repeat here. You use AI to defeat AI. I think building out the right systems in place, and that's another thing when maybe I want to double click on. When we talk about AI, the definition of what we include there now has changed. AI in itself is not a new concept. It existed since the traditional machine learning systems. I think the AI hype that we have been experiencing lately is more around LLMs and agentic AI. So I like to call the traditional machine learning models as a predictor, and then you have LLMs that is a interpreter. They interpret why we think that the score is high and what are the red flags. And then you have an executor or a doer, which is the AI agent. So I think in order to start detecting and taking action on that fraud, in my view, you need to use a combination of those three. And I've seen that successfully implemented. And I think like for the future forward looking, the companies need to start thinking about that. It's not just enough to now have machine learning and just tells you the score. You need to be
Mm.
able to understand the context around it. And you also need to act very quickly, where you may want to pause settlements for that specific merchant without waiting for the manual analyst review to happen.
And for companies, growth is key. And these kind of increased risk systems set up can seem to be slowing down growth. Would you say that's a necessity, or can they work hand in hand?
Yeah, I can see how, and I've seen many examples in the past when that's the case, when risk and compliance is viewed as a blocker, any additional controls slow down conversion. Not necessarily. I think if the system designed right and you take a true risk-based approach, and again, that's where having well-trained models are also critical, right? The model is able to essentially filter out the noise and focus on the merchants or transactions that are truly appear to be high risk, based on the high score. And a lot of it doesn't have the actions that you take also don't have to be as drastic as before. Again, before a manual analyst has a checklist and they go and onboard the merchant, they review the website, they review the documents, okay, approve or decline, or maybe approve with additional controls in place. I think now actually we're able to make all of that much more programmatic. So when you see medium score risk, for example, it doesn't necessarily mean you decline a merchant. It just means that you may want to add some additional controls, or you may want to flag that merchant and continue monitor the merchant. Monitoring is another big piece that I think a lot of the companies kind of under invest in. I think more and more what I'm seeing is transitioning from creating that friction at top of the funnel at onboarding, and then relying on post onboarding continuous monitoring controls and adjusting your system controls and gaps and taking actions accordingly. So again, I think you can be smart about it.
So it sounds like there's a lot of focus on the onboarding, especially with merchants, checking everything out, checking everything's legit. And that's the kind of first step they've passed. But after that, it's much easier for those frauds to change the payments, the websites, etc. So the onboarding is just a speed bump for fraudsters now, and we need to continue to look at them through monitoring and kind of as a not just a single bad transaction, kind of building up over time.
Exactly. Yeah, you hit it. You hit it right there. Because as I said, I think now with onboarding and the documents that are being provided and the websites are being provided, it is getting a little harder. So I think for consumers, I think we started out there. For consumers, I think you need to make a decision very quickly, right there, if you onboard the consumer or not. And then for consumer transactions as well, you either block or you approve,
Yeah.
or you trigger a step up where you may want to ask for some additional
Mm.
identity verification. For merchants, I think you have a little bit more time in a way. And I think that the most critical period, and studies have shown that generally speaking, majority of the fraud happens within the first 90 days of the merchant past merchant onboarding.
Yeah.
So monitoring closely the first 30 days after the merchant was onboarded is very critical. Once you have observed that, I think it's still important to kind of keep an eye on the merchant in the remaining 60 days, which will make the 90-day life cycle. But you can just onboarding signals are no longer enough. You need the dynamic indicators that you would be able to get from the transactional behavior. Again, even signals that I mentioned, are they processing with the right URL? This is the kind of stuff you won't be able to detect at onboarding, but you can certainly see that as they start transacting.
So is it more sophisticated in merchant fraud, and therefore the fraudsters are willing to be patient and maybe get past these 60, 90 days? Is that what the data's showing?
It's another excellent point because fraudsters, they're really good at using different playbooks, sharing playbooks, and learning all the tips and tricks and getting around the system. And yeah, and to your point, dormant merchants is where you also see where they may get onboarded and they start with very normal transaction cycle, small transactions, kind of spaced out, nothing unusual. And then as they kind of get past that 90-day high risk probationary period, all of a sudden you see the transaction growth, disputes are escalating, refunds are escalating, and all of that. Yes, merchants are definitely, fraudsters are definitely aware of that and they're using that. And again, I think going back to the concept of continuous monitoring, I can't emphasize enough how important that is because fraud happens across all the multiple phases of a merchant lifecycle, and it doesn't stop at onboarding, and it doesn't stop within 90 days.
And you mentioned there about fraudsters sharing information and learning tricks and knowing what's going on. So it sounds like collusion is quite an issue. Would you say, or from what you've seen, is it more so than on the consumer side, or is it similar?
I think on the consumer side, I think we're seeing it everywhere. I think that, but I've definitely seen collusion on the merchant side. I think on the consumer side, if you're just one consumer, you're not colluding with others, it's just really hard to execute a massive attack. So you do need to work with other groups, but it may look different in how it's executed. On the merchant side, what we've seen quite a bit, and I can share like a specific example for my buy now, pay later, which was kind of mind blowing for me. I've never seen that. We're definitely seeing more and more where a merchant's beneficial owner or a merchant's employee or family, friends, they're acting as a consumer and there is no bona fide transaction that actually happens. It's just exchange of money. And then, of course, on the consumer side, in that type of a collusion scenario, you start seeing refunds, where basically that's a way for them to get their cash out. And the one example specific of the collusion that I've seen in buy now, pay later, it's quite interesting. Basically, again, for those of you who are not familiar with how it works, it's a short-term loan, 4 installments. So you buy a product at 25%, and then over the course of 6 weeks, you repay the remaining balance. And so the difference here is that the merchant gets paid for that purchase right away, full amount, right? Yeah. So you buy something that's $100, the merchant gets paid $100 right away. And so in this scenario, if the merchant is colluding with the consumer, you get the money. Then on the consumer side, you only pay 25% of that purchase price. And the scenarios go two ways. Either the consumer never makes that repayment, they get the good, they go and resell it at the secondary market, especially goods that are really popular, some types of sneakers or electronics, they're very easily resold. So you get the good at the 25% price, you stop making repayments, you already got settled as well, and then you go and sell it as well. Or some merchants are doing that because they need some additional cash flow. So it's almost like a loan, and they end up making repayments still, but they already got that $100 upfront. It's a small amount, but it accumulates over time.
Would it be fair to generalize merchant fraud as more of a team sport in that case? And it's very rare that it's individuals that are committing the fraud?
On the fraudster side?
Yeah, there's more moving parts. Is that?
I think all fraud is a team sport. Especially now, I think, as I mentioned, with AI technologies, they're getting so good at using AI agents, and they're not just using one AI agent. So they will use one agent that will get the context, and that agent will share context with a different agent. And they're, as a team, they're coordinating together and they're sharing different signals to get to the point where they need to be able to get through either onboarding or whatever it is. So again, like thinking about the fraud attacks that we had before, the card testing, that was pretty obvious transaction patterns. You just have a bunch of robots that are just sending large volumes of these cards and they're testing it. Now you may have several agents, but they're working over a longer period of time to try and hack that system and sharing this information. So Yeah, I think you could call it a team sport.
Is it, to me, it always seems like it's much more difficult when you've got a consumer, a merchant. It sounds like it's a lot harder to detect. Would you say that's fair? Picking up sounds like it's more like little breadcrumbs as opposed to obvious activity when it comes to merchant fraud.
I don't know if I would say if it's easier to detect or harder to detect, because I think with the deep fakes and synthetic identities that we're seeing on the consumer side, it's also getting really, really hard because the signals we used to be able to trust are no longer the signals we can trust,
Mm.
right? The liveliness checks that we're still using, or the voice. Again, I think you may have seen some Altman talking about how banks are using voice verification. It's just getting so sophisticated. So I think we're also running out of like the signals, the trustworthy signals that you can
Mm.
use. But I think to your point on the merchant side, yeah, I think the complexity and the levels of sophistication and the patterns and how it happens is more complex for sure. I think you kind of alluded to that, the data sharing. I think the examples I've shared where we were able to detect collusion was only made possible because Cash App Pay or Afterpay or PayPal or
Yeah.
other two-sided networks, they have that data sharing because they
Mm.
work with both parties. And so that's where you're able to do graph linking and share signals across consumers and merchants and being able to identify similar assets like the addresses, the phone numbers, the similar bank accounts. So that makes it really hard. If you only have visibility into one side of the player, then it becomes really, really, really complicated. And that's where I'm hearing a lot. Like an example is a merchant risk council conferences where, yeah, a lot of processors, they only work with merchants, right? And then the consumer data, the consumer signals are actually sitting with issuers. And so that's where we as an industry need to get better as sharing those different signals with each other. But I think we're a long way away from it.
So we could stop fraud tomorrow. In theory, the fraud programs fail not because of the bad models or the bad systems, it's context and fragmented across teams. Commercially, do you think we'll get to a point where companies will be a lot more freely, will be a lot more open to sharing these data between the merchants, the issuers, the consumer side, etc.? Do you think that will happen, or will it always be some siloed information?
I think in order for that to happen, we need a federal regulatory mandate.
Mm.
And we've seen, in Europe and other jurisdictions where that was more successful. There's always going to be like if you look at attempts to create data consortiums, because I think
Mhm.
everybody's saying the same thing. We're all saying
Yeah.
that we need better data sharing, and then a lot of companies, their vendors who have created consortiums to a certain degree. I think the networks as well, the Visa, MasterCard is also
Mm.
trying to do that to a certain extent, but I think we're still not there. If you compare the data sharing that happens amongst fraudsters and the data sharing we do as part of the ecosystem, and I think you touched on commercial aspects, absolutely, right? There's always, as the data consortiums get launched, and
Mm.
then you're trying to ask players to join one, the normal questions are who's part of that consortium, what are you going to do with my data, and like, there is always this fear that the data you're sharing is going to be used by somebody else for
Mm.
their own marketing
Yeah.
efforts or commercial efforts. So again, I think like while everybody's recognizing the problem and the fraud and the losses, I think it also became a norm that this is just a cost of doing business. And I
Mhm.
think unless there is some really hard regulatory mandate, I'm not very optimistic that's going to happen.
There's no incentive, right? I mean, if you're a big player, you've got a lot of data, a lot of visibility that other people don't necessarily have. Why would you? Right?
Yeah, that's one. Two, I think also the fraud losses are distributed. And so I don't think there's just one player in our ecosystem that absorbs all the losses. It's going to be split among consumers, the issuers, the acquirer, the banks, the processors, so on and so forth. And so the pain is almost not concentrated enough with one to try and do something about it. That is my hypothesis.
It's extremely the pain is shared out, and it's not significant for one person, so it's not painful enough yet for one of the players. Interesting. And we mentioned a few times the rise of AI and the cost of fraud is becoming cheaper and cheaper, but then the cost of fighting back is rising and rising. We have to do even more and more. Is it going to get a point where we can't continue to invest?
That's a great question. Unless you just want to eat that loss and also have your reputation, um, under risk. We have to invest. I think the question is for a lot of companies, and I know a lot of companies are having this debate, is that something that you're investing to build out internally? Or is that something that you're using external vendors? And I think that's where, again, like going back to the point of fraudsters are really good at sharing their playbooks, right? I think vendors might also be really good at sharing the data the trends and what they're seeing on their side. So there's definitely, I think there are definitely situations and use cases where it's better to use those vendors. And some vendors have created pretty solid consortiums. Again, not to the point, not ideal state, but it's getting there. So yeah, I think I think it's not a question of whether we'll stop investing. I don't think we will. It's a question of how much and with and where.
And we're seeing different tactics, right? So risk teams, they're starting to shift left, I think is quite a popular term at the moment. Does that kind of improve efficiency, especially kind of during onboarding? Does that help bring the cost down a little bit?
By adding AI technologies?
Yes.
Yeah, I think that I've seen personally where if you're going to think about the risk or compliance operational work, I like to kind of break it out into 3 levels. So level 1 is, the simple, repeatable work that can be easily explained by a very detailed SOP. And level 2 is more of an escalation. Level 3 is more complex escalation.
Yeah.
And I think what we're seeing is that, yeah, the level 1 work, we are able to increasingly well replace or augment with AI, agentic AI. And again, the majority of that work is the work that's easily explainable, repeatable. As you get to the next level and it requires more human judgment, it becomes harder. But even within level 2 work, you're able to automate some pieces of the work. So for example, if 9 years ago, my analyst had to pull all the documents manually and use the vendor signal, go to the vendor portal to look it up. Now with AI, you're able to actually collect that context automatically. Like one example, and I'm seeing this increasingly being adopted, is the website and social media signals. LLMs are really good and AI agents are really good at going out there in the universe and collecting as much context around that merchant. And so you can still use the data that's being collected by AI technologies to make your own human judgment. So yeah, I think going back to your point, in that way, it's making it easier. On the other side, for human risk and compliance analysts, you are almost starting to deal with more complex problems in your day to day. I had a conversation with MRC CEO around this outside of fraud, and we're like, man, we're using agents now to help us with the day to day work and stuff that we generally maybe so excited to do, some administrative. And you would expect that it will free up your day. But what ends up happening, actually, your day gets filled with those more complicated decisions that you actually need to make. So that's what I'm seeing is happening. And I think also like the risk profile and the competencies for risk or compliance analysts are starting to change. It's no longer just about policy and checklist. I think it's much more around understanding how those technologies work, the data science behind it, partnering with machine learning models, with product and engineers to help design that system.
Is it, would you say it's a combination of teams being a bit leaner as well as scope increasing, complexity, volume of fraud? Is it just like a perfect storm that we thought we'd be doing less work and we're just doing more?
I wish I could say that, yeah, we're able to make the teams leaner. I think what I'm seeing is that the teams are getting leaner in the pockets where I said, it's a little bit more repetitive work that can be replaced. But I think we need more resources that are now able to use their judgment, their experience to help battle those new patterns that fraudsters are coming up with. And so we need that expertise. So to be honest, I think we need more time to see. And I know there's a lot of anxiety around that AI is taking over our jobs. In risk and compliance space, I'm not super concerned about it for the reasons that I mentioned. I think what I'm seeing is like the repeatable work is maybe getting automated, but the more sophisticated fraud scenarios require skilled folks who are able to actually help detect the design systems to help battle that.
Mm.
Um, but this is also like an interesting point around the future of BPOs and what's going to happen there. And I know there's some BPOs that I've talked to, they're already starting to think about it. Where like a lot of the bodies of work that are being outsourced to BPOs, even they're starting to partner with agentic AI companies to automate
Mm.
this work, and they're investing in like on the compliance side in analysts who are CAM certified, who are skilled and their experience, etc. So it's an interesting shift that's happening.
I think it's quite a unique industry to be in, right? Because the force is equal and opposite, right? So you could, if the fraud protection and prevention and risk and compliance are making things more efficient and leaner, then it's happening on the same side, on the other side as well, which increases. So it's personally, I think it's an industry to be. I don't know how to say job security, but it's always going to be needed, right? Because the force is equal and opposites. The easier it gets for compliance teams, the easier it's going to get for fraudsters. Their volume increases, their sophistication increases. There has to be something, right?
Yeah. To your point, I'm not super worried about job security here. Maybe I shouldn't say that, but yeah, I think yeah, exactly. There's not a perfect equilibrium there. I think that for fraudsters is becoming cheaper and easier to commit fraud, and then on the other side, yep, we're able to solve for some of the operational work, but then the sophistication of the new fraud that's being committed, it is requiring quite a different skill set now.
And to put you on the spot, maybe as we close out, when it comes to AI within risk and compliance, what do you think is hype? What do you think is underestimated and maybe should be used a little bit more?
Within the context of risk compliance specifically, I think that, and actually, I don't fully agree in general that AI is hype.
Mm.
Okay, yeah, there's excitement, but that's normal. When something new comes out, I think people get excited. And then, from there, you figure out, okay, how can you use it and
Yeah.
where it's applicable? And so, yeah, I think like as you calibrate on those use cases, you are not going to use AI for everything, but it doesn't necessarily mean that there is something like inherently wrong with it. I think what we should be doing more of, specifically in the risk compliance space, is we really need to think about governance and explainability. And I know there are already conversations. I see a lot of LinkedIn posts about it,
Yeah.
but I think that increasingly so, when working with banks, we're getting questions around, okay, well, we've used AI here, and what did it do? What procedures
Mm.
did it follow, right? So in my view, I think LLMs are great. You can use
Yeah.
them for a variety of cases, but making sure your agent is operating within the construct that has the context that's explainable, and okay, this is what the procedure that it followed, these are the steps that it followed, and this is how that's the oversight we have over that. I think that is something that we really need to think about more and more, because LLMs are a black box. You put
Mm.
something in, and we all know that they hallucinate, and like you don't get the same answer every time you put it in. So I think it's fine to use it maybe for explaining the context around something where there's a red signal on a merchant or on a consumer, but fully relying on that and take action, we need to be more careful about it.
Does it scare you that it might get to a point where humans can't keep up? So we have to blindly trust LLMs and etc. to make the decision for us?
Never trust just LLM to make decision for me. Though I know there was just a hot conversation around agentic commerce and
Yeah.
having actually, yeah, let me retract that. I shouldn't say I never will. I will, but maybe not in the risk and compliance space. There's a debate around the adoption of agentic commerce, where do you as a consumer trust Perplexity or ChatGPT enough to go and research and make a purchase for you? And I think the answers I'm hearing increasingly is that for stuff that you just reorder commodities, right? Whatever
Yeah.
you have on your Amazon subscription, that's fine. People generally feel comfortable. If you want to spend 5,000 on vacation ticket, that's 5 months out. You may be a little bit more careful, but you will probably want LLM to do the research for you and then identify some options and track the prices there. So I think this is an interesting debate. Whether it's going to get out of control, hope not. I don't know if I have an answer for that. I think people who are much smarter and much more technologically advanced, I think they're warning us, saying that, guys, like, you really need to be careful about what we're doing
Mm.
here. I've also just heard another story where I think somebody was using Claude Cowork, the
Yeah.
new agent by Claude, and it was running overnight. And in the morning, the person woke up and they saw a 300 purchase on their account to LinkedIn. And so what Claude Cowork did was they said, "Hey, I noticed that I think your LinkedIn posts are not as great. And I think you need to take this learning course with LinkedIn." And so they actually went ahead and made the purchase on behalf. So I think for us as humans, we need to be really careful about also what are we saying, what are we asking, what are the permission controls that we're giving, and like what is it that we want to do
Mm.
to sure that AIs don't take over fully.
Yeah, it's gonna be. We're gonna have our own personal risk and compliance teams, just for our daily use. We'll
Yep,
have an
second
agent.
line oversight.
Exactly. I mean, we could hypothetically go into this and have some fun for hours, I think, but that is all we have time for today. It's been an absolute pleasure. If people want to keep up your work, any events, anything you got coming up this year,
Yeah, actually, well, next week it's a smaller event. I'm going to University of Utah for a fintech exchange. Actually, fraud, AI, and fraud is a topic we're going to be
there we
chatting
go.
about.
This is a
And
warm
then,
up for you.
yeah, there is actually I just posted on LinkedIn. There is a pretty cool event. It's a new event that's coming up. It's called Safeguard. And
Yep.
this event, organized by co-founders of Money 2020 and a few other events, it's specifically focused on AI, and it's AI in risk, fraud, and compliance. And so there's going to be a lot of, it's more of a practitioner to practitioner conversations. So
Okay.
I'm personally very excited because, these are the kinds of conversation I'm hoping to have there as well. It's in May 3rd through 6th in Colorado Springs. So if
Yeah,
anybody wants to join.
with Brian and Matul. Right, we had them on the podcast earlier in the season, and they were telling us all about it. So I
Oh,
think it's
great.
I think it's up there. I think it's number one if you're in AI, identity, fraud, compliance, and it's a must for sure.
I'm pretty excited about it. Yeah.
Yes, well, thank you once again. Absolute pleasure. And to the listeners, thank you for joining us. We'll see you next time.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye bye.